By the time Greg Biffle's airplane lifted off, it was already dealing with multiple problems, mechanical, procedural, and human, all at the same time. And one by one, those problems quietly removed the margins this crew needed to survive. But there are some points from the NTSB prelim on this crash that no one is really talking about. Let's find out what they are on Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. I'm on the road traveling and have been without internet. But this has allowed me to step back and take a deeper look on the NTSB prelim report that's out on the Greg Biffle crash. And it gave me some time to talk to Citation pilots and owners. And I found out some things that really no one else is talking about. Also, I'll cover what the similarities are between the DCA mid-air collision and this Citation crash and what that means to you and me. And before we start, I want to say that my heart goes out to the families of those that died, especially a mother who lost her daughter, and so many that lost friends and family. Nothing about the morning of December 18th, 2025 suggested that it would end any differently than thousands of other departures from Statesville Regional Airport. The airplane sat on the south parking ramp, got fully fueled, passengers boarded. Flying as the pilot in command in the left seat of the Citation 550 was an ATP-rated pilot who was the only one on board with a rating to fly this Citation, a jet that required 2 rated pilots. And the first thing no one is really talking about is that his type rating for this Citation was actually relatively new. This pilot had flown as a career for a major airline. He was rated in a variety of airliners, extremely experienced. In very complex flight decks with advanced technology like auto throttles, that's where he had gotten his experience. But according to his most recent FAA certificate issued in May of 2025, his CE 500 rating, which is what you need for the Citation 550, had the limitation of must-have SIC, second in command, a co-pilot. Now, this doesn't mean he was a bad pilot or had any problems with the rating check ride. Every pilot new to this rating gets this limitation. Then the pilot can get that restriction removed with a check ride, and there's usually minimum hours in type before you can apply for that. Then when you have enough time in type and you've gotten that limitation removed, the pilot can then fly a CE 500 series that is rated for single pilot operations, which this 550 was not rated for single pilot operations. Now, as you progress in the rating, you can apply for a single pilot exemption, which then allows you to be a single pilot on certain 2 pilot rated Citations. All right, but back to our left seat pilot. He had only the new CE 500 rating with the must-have SIC limitation. Okay, the other passengers. The left seat pilot's adult son was in the right seat. The NTSB prelim refers to him as a pilot-rated passenger, and he had his private pilot and recently gotten his instrument rating. He had 175.3 hours total, and that's in general aviation single-engine piston aircraft, not complicated private jets. The third passenger the NTSB prelim report talks about is a pilot-rated passenger sitting in the cabin but close to the flight deck. This is Greg Biffle. He had his private pilot single engine, his multi-engine, and his rotor. A minor point, but the prelim has incorrect information attributing Biffle to having an instrument rating, which I have confirmed he did not have. In addition to these 3, which I'll refer to as left seat pilot or pilot in command, right seat pilot, and Greg, there were 4 passengers in the back, which included Greg's wife and son and a daughter from a previous marriage and a friend. So that sets the table as far as the people. When they took their seats, it was already an illegal flight, having only 1 pilot when 2 were legally required. All right, let's talk about the weather. The prelim report shows the pilots getting the AWOS, that's the automated weather, at 9:45 a.m. And the winds were calm, visibility 10 statute miles, ceiling broken at 3,900 feet above the ground, 4,800 feet overcast. 9 minutes later, they got the automated weather again, and it was now 3,900 feet scattered ceiling and 5,000 overcast, so a little better. And this gives the airplane and crew a little more cushion for visual flying to take off from the non-towered airport and then pick up their IFR clearance with air traffic control in the air before they get into the clouds. But the weather was deteriorating. A front was coming in. And within 20 minutes of that last automated weather report, visibility was cut in half. There was heavy drizzle and ceiling was now 1,200 feet above the ground, broken. The cockpit voice recorder began capturing audio at 9:44 a.m. local time, and the trouble began at the start, literally. According to the NTSB, they were unsuccessful getting the number one engine started, and they were using the battery power on board, not from a ground power unit. This could be important. Citation experts and owners I talked to say they probably moved to starting engine number 2, the right engine, and then once that started, they used the generator from the right side to get the number 1 started. It's called a cross-generator start, which isn't unusual. The prelim report states that both engines were going at 9:53. And here's another thing that's not really talked about much, the start generators. This failed to start engine 1 is something investigators will be looking at to see if it impacted the electrical failures that they experienced minutes later. On this Citation were 2 generators, 1 for each engine. The plane's electrical system can be run on 1 generator, but once the engine starts, the generators are usually turned on, and that's done on the flight deck. Another thing the investigation will be looking for will be any breakers that might have tripped or were off. The prelim report doesn't give any information on this. For the electrical system on the Citation, the battery is designed to last about 45 minutes. And on emergency power, the battery gives you only select few instruments and a radio. But there are some things that draw more power than others, like the anti-icing system. And all this is stuff the investigators will focus on. And another thing not really talked about in research, talking to Citation experts and instructors, some students at some point in their training on the Citation accidentally, after gear retraction, they turn off the inverter and or avionics switches when meaning to turn off the igniters on these older Citations, which is needed for many of the instruments. And I mention all of this to paint a picture of the complex environment for piloting a Citation. We don't know the status of the inverter or the generators in this event. All right, back to the timeline. Taxi began at 9:59. During the taxi, according to the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, there was talk among the left seat pilot, the pilot-rated passenger, and Greg Biffle that centered on the failure of a thrust reverser indicator light for an unspecified engine. And while the pilots might feel the reverser stow, it's a serious no-fly situation. The Citation then continued, crossing runway 1028 and got into position on 10 for departure. The prelim doesn't tell us if the pre-flight checklists were used. They could have been. But another thing Citation pilots, really most professional pilots, do is they use a toll card, a takeoff and landing card. Pilots need to know a bunch of speeds for every specific flight, like V1, VR, V2, VREF, the landing speed. You calculate these on the ground and have them posted where you can see them, especially when you're fully loaded and possibly over max gross landing weight. You need to know what your approach and landing speed is in the event of an emergency after takeoff. And we don't know yet if a toll card was created for this flight. Traditionally, the first officer or the second in command, they do the chart. The left seat pilot, having flown for a major and recently retired, had been a captain and far removed from those first officer days of having to fill all that information out. And certainly on his check ride for the Citation rating months before, he would have had to have had a toll card or probably would have failed the check ride. But all that information was needed during this flight, and we don't know if it was done. Takeoff occurred at approximately 10:06 a.m. The flight departed under VFR with the intention of picking up its IFR clearance once airborne. During the takeoff roll, the left seat pilot was flying, and the prelim does say that the right seat pilot was doing checklists at that point and working the radio. Greg, watching the takeoff from right behind them, said during the takeoff roll, and it was picked up by the CVR, that the left engine was producing more power than the right and possibly a faulty gauge. The prelim has these ominous words: "The pilot continued the takeoff." Initial climb looked normal. Preliminary GPS data shows the airplane entering a climbing left turn at 10:07:19 seconds. The left seat pilot stated on the CVR that he would remain VFR until they received their IFR clearance, and at roughly 10:08, the airplane had turned through approximately 180 degrees, and then things began to unravel. The aircraft continued turning left, and then it began to descend. Between 10:08 and 10:10, the right seat passenger attempted 3 separate times to contact Atlanta Center, ATC, to activate their IFR flight plan, and none of those calls were successful. According to the report, controller workload and radio congestion prevented the clearance from being picked up. We don't know if Center acknowledged the call or told them to stand by, or if they never even acknowledged it. If there were electrical problems that were starting to be evident, it's unclear at this time if the radio was working properly. We do know later it was, and I'll get to that. 10:09, 37 seconds. This is key. The Garmin GTN 750 stopped recording airspeed data. They were right over the River Oaks golf course here. The 750 is a NAVCOM GPS radio unit and has the ability to record some data. At 10:10 and 14 seconds, the CVR on the left side and the audio panel goes dead for 3 minutes and 55 seconds. 4 seconds later, the left seat pilot talks about losing his altimeter and possibly other instruments. At 10:10:58, the 750 stopped recording heading data. Things were piling up. There was no CVR indicating that the right seat instruments were having any failures. They were 5 minutes into the flight. It was at this time control of the plane passed to the right seat passenger at an altitude of 4,500 feet MSL. According to the METAR, this would put them in the clouds and in the middle of a left turn here. At 10:11 and 4 seconds, the CVR quality degrades for all channels for the next 3 minutes and 5 seconds. 2 minutes later, it's now 10:13. They are heading back to the airport, and they've dropped to 1,870 feet MSL, which is about 900 feet above the ground. And both front seaters mentioned being able to see the ground. Around this time, the left seat pilot took back the controls, but the prelim mentions there was no recorded transfer of control. And for those non-pilots, there have been numerous crashes and loss of life because each pilot thought the other was the one actually flying. We're drilled in our training to conduct a 3-way communication for the positive transfer of controls of who's flying. In other words, pilot A says, "I've got the flight controls." Pilot B says, "You have the flight controls." Then pilot A one more time says, "I have the flight controls." NTSB is saying they didn't hear that, or even one person saying, "My controls." At 10:13 and 3 seconds, the left seat pilot called for flaps, though it's not clear if that was full flaps or which flap setting. The prelim report says they turned right into a westerly heading at this time, but the ADS-B shows at this moment they were heading east in a downwind for runway 28. And I don't know if that's just another error in the prelim report or what. At 10:13 and 22 seconds, the left seat pilot called for gear. I show them heading east abeam the departure end of runway 10 at this point. The gear indication lights were not illuminated. And 20 seconds later, the right seat pilot on the radio over the Statesville Common Traffic Advisory channel said in part, "We're having some issues here." And the left seat pilot veered right, probably seeing that he was too close to the airport to be able to turn base and final for runway 28. 17 seconds later, at 10:14 and 5 seconds, Greg asked the left seat pilot about the alternator, probably meaning generator since there are no alternators on the Citation. 4 seconds later, suddenly the audio quality returned and the left seat pilot made a statement that that was the problem. Investigators will be looking at whether the generator switch or switches had been off and the plane had been running on battery up to that point. 5 seconds later, the Citation turned left for the base to final. The 750 started recording airspeed data again. At 10:14 and 50 seconds, the airplane turned final for runway 28. He was 270 feet above the ground at 114 knots indicated. He was heavy, he was low, and he was slow. 10 seconds later, 10:15 and 0 seconds, left seat pilot stated he had acquired the runway. He could see it. The recorded data from the GTN 750 showed that the airspeed and altitude continued to decrease until 10:15 and 18 seconds when the 750 recorded 984 feet MSL, which would be 24 feet above the ground, and 99 knots indicated. Now, some of the math here is a little off in the prelim report. The last 5 seconds when it showed 942 feet MSL, which would be technically 18 feet below the 960-foot threshold of runway 28. The bottom line, they were low. Last data from the 750 for speed was 93 knots indicated. The aircraft impacted terrain near the airport perimeter fence, about 350 feet from the first identified point of impact, continuing through the Mauser light station before coming to rest roughly 400 feet short of the runway 28 threshold, oriented eastbound. A post-impact fire consumed most of the fuselage. All 7 occupants were fatally injured. When investigators arrived, they documented what the wreckage could tell them. Both engines remained attached to their pylons. Both thrust reversers were found in the stowed position. The throttle quadrant showed both thrust levers full forward and both reverse levers down, consistent with a stowed configuration. There was no evidence of an uncontained engine failure. Full throttles with 2 working engines would not have led to such low speeds, so investigators will be trying to piece together the actions of the pilot in the last few seconds. Did he suddenly realize how slow he was and attempted to push full throttles and just didn't have enough time? That's one of the big questions they'll be looking at. Many had thought there had been an engine failure. The number 1 engine's low-pressure turbine blades were intact and undamaged. Its fan blades showed damage at the tips. The inlet surfaces exhibited circumferential scoring, marks consistent with rotational contact rather than like explosive failure. The number 2 engine showed similar patterns: intact turbine blades, damaged fan blades, and a mostly detached inlet. And these were impact-related signatures, not precursors. All flight control surfaces were accounted for in the debris field. There was no evidence of any pre-impact structural breakup. And with that, 7 people are gone in an instant. There's some huge takeaways from this NTSB prelim report. First, there are some important parts very similar to the mid-air crash at Washington Reagan National. And we did a report a couple of days about this. Normalization of deviation. Say you break the rules for the first time and nothing bad happens. Pretty soon you're breaking it all the time and it becomes normal. Certainly by the NTSB prelim, there were several rules, important rules, that were skirted. Single pilot when there was supposed to be 2. Still flying when you have a failed indication on the thrust reversers, a no-fly situation. Going into clouds when you're flying VFR. Breaking rules like this is not a problem until it's a problem, which leads me to the word respect. Pilots and anyone working in a hazardous field need to respect their chosen profession, and I need to respect aviation. And this means not getting complacent, but dotting the I's and crossing the T's, which is something I don't like to do. Even if I've done it 1,000 times, to keep doing it. And keep following these rules that were written in blood. Another takeaway, and with this one, I'm not saying it happened here, but this crash serves as a reminder to me, and maybe it will for some of you, of what I call the Celebrity Passenger Syndrome, CPS. Look, I brought this up originally, and a few of you commented that if I don't know that this was a factor in the crash, I shouldn't bring it up. But I'm saying that for me, and maybe some of you, you can take away from this a reminder to say no. As a pilot, if I had a celebrity aboard, I need to make sure I'm not trying to please him or her. And it stretches to a bunch of other areas in life. You make a questionable decision because you want to impress someone, or someone you look up to asks you to do something you're not comfortable with. It reminds me that I'm totally willing and able to say no, that I need to say no at times. No flying today. And again, let me stress, I'm not saying that CPS happened here, just that it could be a possibility, and it can be a tool to remind us of CPS and the importance of saying no. This was a horrible crash, and certainly one that was preventable according to the evidence presented in the prelim report. My prayers go out to the families and friends. This can't be easy. My hope is that those of us left behind can learn from it and make us better pilots and better people. And if you want to see the report on the NTSB meeting about the DCA crash that we just did, I'll put a link here on the screen and I'll pin a comment. That's all I've got. Remember, superior judgment trumps superior skill. Take care.